So I did my paper on police sexual misconduct and how that disproportionately affects women. Something I learned is that it's the second most reported form of police misconduct, right behind excessive force. I think it's important to talk about it because in the times we're living in, Me Too, stuff like that, it's important to look at how that affects policing too and the citizens who are affected by policing. A big problem lies with police sexual misconduct. It's hard to know which resources are available and who to report it to, and this can cause discrepancies in stats. Some of the stats we'll look at, uh, we know the numbers are low because people aren't reporting the assaults that are occurring. One young woman was sexually assaulted by an undercover officer as she walked to her bus stop, and later, when she tried to report him, she was jailed instead of being helped. That's just one story, but there are plenty of stories where reporting doesn't work the way that victims would like it to. The first research paper I found looked at loopholes in the law, specifically in South Carolina, in which police officers are actually allowed to have sexual relations with a detainee if they can prove consent. There's a few big problems with this. First of all, consent doesn't really work that way when there's such a power imbalance. Um, the report also talked about a lack of criminal prosecution because it's basically taking the police's word over the detainees, and they can just say they had consent and it's hard to prove that they didn't. Another problem with reporting sexual misconduct is something we talked about in this class a lot, uh, the blue wall of silence. Victims might feel like they're alone because, you know, other police officers aren't helping them or giving them guidance at all. One positive is that uh, these loopholes that we've talked about, which happen in a lot of different states, are being closed up slowly, but it's still happening. Victims are getting more justice in certain situations, but there's still a lot that needs to be changed, especially in states with loopholes that consent is still allowed. The second research article I looked into was more solely focused on statistics. It talked a little bit about effects, but I'll go more into detail about the certain statistics that I found, but just some big numbers that I thought were important. Um, the report found that 83% of victims of sexual misconduct from police were female, which isn't super surprising, but still, it's something that needs to be talked about. Um, and another number is that 45% of victims were children, which is just something terrible. I mean, we all know we're supposed to trust the police from a young age. Most of us probably had a DARE program or something like that where it's being preached. We can trust the police, and some officers are obviously using that, and it's truly like disheartening. Um, Something that's better at least is that when a cop is caught, assaulting a child, it's there's no consent loophole for that. Um, but it's adults aren't so lucky. They still have to deal with stuff like that, and that's why these reports only took into account victims or officers who were arrested. So we have to take that into account. There's so many more cases where uh, the offender just wasn't caught, or they couldn't convict an officer who had assaulted somebody. Something else that the paper talked about was how reports might be downgraded. So, you know, a victim might be talking about what happened to them, and police officers might downgrade that to something they call like an unpleasant experience, instead of a serious category, so that nothing happens to their fellow police officers. Something we talked about with the blue wall of silence. Um, so when like we get reports or something like that, these stats that we're looking at, the numbers are so downgraded because um, officers are downgrading what actually happened, or not telling like the truth of what actually happened. Um, and it's also important to talk about what's happening. I know these like the numbers when it talked about children being victims of this, it kind of opened my eyes to how big of a problem this was, and I don't think people really know about that. So it's going to be hard for things to change if society can't learn about these things. Um, Another problem that the paper talked about was how there's a big power imbalance, and that can be used to victimize interns, domestic abuse victims, to sexually assault them too, which is another huge problem that I didn't even know about. And I already talked about, or a little bit about, how what I learned. I obviously learned that children being victimized is such a big problem. It's something I didn't know of. I kind of had this notion that police would use their, like, negotiate the power they had to get sexual favors. Like, I'll downgrade your charges if you do something for me. But I didn't think about them assaulting children like this, and how much power they have there too. Um, I think it's getting better, but there's still so much room to go. These loopholes are closing, but it's not happening fast enough, and people are still being victimized to this day. Um, I think the biggest problem is it needs to be discussed more. I barely would have thought about this if I didn't read these research papers. Um, and I think, good police officers need to hold others accountable. There can't be this blue wall of silence, and they can't be downgrading charges. They need to talk about it and get the bad cops out of there. It's going to make them look better. It's going to make society a safer place and just give them more trust and respect. The last thing I would say in summation is just, if you can, do your own research. I think it's something that not a lot of us know about, but it can really be important to changing how police interact with people and how we go forward in a society. I think if we're going to look up to police and trust them, and we want to change how society is being ran, especially as it relates to sexual misconduct, we have to change how police act too. I think that'll help society become better.